Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Tony Robles. Welcome to Listen and Be Heard Radio on WPVM FM, the voice of Asheville. And you can get us online, WPVMFM.org. Today, we have a wonderful guest who has written a wonderful book of short stories. A lot of what we do here is, we get into the heads of writers, but we also ask them about craft and what kind of makes them tick, how they have navigated their way towards writing, what their inspirations are, and so on. Evalina Galang is a
Oh,
wonderful writer, and she has a wonderful new book. I love the title and I love the cover. It's called When the Hibiscus Falls. And let me just read quickly from Evelina's bio, which we are oftentimes obligated to do on our program. But Evelina Galang is the daughter of Filipino-American immigrants who first came to the United States in the mid 1950s. Born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, she is the eldest of six. By the time she was 12, she had moved to seven cities. Okay, that's a lot of moving. Seven cities before her family settled in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. She is the author of two novels, two story collections, and a work of nonfiction, and is the editor of Screaming Monkeys, Critiques of Asian American Images. And she draws from the stories she grew up on and the research from a Fulbright Senior Scholar Award, as well as numerous grants and fellowships from the University of Miami, which she calls home. Evelina, welcome to Listen and Be Heard Radio.
hey, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for reading that obligatory bio.
Well, we all, have our roots and we have places that we're from. And you have a very, very interesting background. When I was at Vermont College of Fine Arts, I got my MFA there. Brian Leung, the novelist, was one of my he was one of my I guess advisors. And we had to come up with a reading list, my own personal reading list. He says, "Oh, you have to read Evalina Galang. Please just get one of her books." So I said, well, yeah, for sure. And the typhoon is a hurricane. I think that's the name of it, right? Or the hurricane
The
is a
name of
typhoon.
that the hurricane, the typhoon is a hurricane, which is a story in When the Hibiscus Falls.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that was the book that that was the story that I read. And I want to start off just by asking you, your book, uh, this wonderful collection here, When the Hibiscus Falls, a collection of short stories. It deals with many different themes, obligation, silence, shame, among many others. I wanted to ask you, how biographical are the stories in this collection?
Oh, that's a good question. I think, there's all. I had a teacher once who said that good fiction is part memory,
Hmm.
uh, but also part imagination. And then it kind of takes off from there. So for me, a lot of those stories are rooted in, I think, some kind of an experience or something I witnessed living in all those different places, always rooted in the Filipino community. Um, Maybe a couple of visits home to the Philippines with family, things I'd seen, and then really just that is the seed, and I have to disclaim, none of it is true, and yet all of it is true.
Yeah, I mean, one of the advisors at Vermont was saying that, fiction is not reality, it's heightened reality, and
Mhm.
that, in our quest to get as close to verisimilitude as possible, that sometimes we forget that. You mentioned family, and I know family is very important in your work. I know that, your father passed away, and he was very important, a very important source of inspiration. Can you talk about your parents? I know that they had immigrated, I guess you had said in the 1950s, they had come from the Philippines. Talk about them and the influence that they've had on your work, because we actually had Oliver de la Paz
Yeah.
as a guest, and he described his work insofar as how it relates to his father. He described it as a monument. He's leaving a monument behind for his kids to know who their father was. So talk about
Absolutely.
your parents.
Yeah. Well, my parents, so my dad was a physician, and he had come to Milwaukee to do his residency there. That's what he was doing. He had not yet met my mother. My mom also came about around the same time in the late 50s, and she was at Marquette University in the
Mm,
English department there. She's getting her master's in literature. And he from the hospital side of it, and she there at Marquette, were invited to do the very, very first Filipino culture night at
mm,
Marquette. So that's how they got to know each other. They met one another, they got to know each other. They started off right away. I mean, there were hardly any Filipino men at Marquette. So they like went to the hospital to go recruit the doctors. And so my dad was one of those leaders. And it's so funny. Many, many years later, like 40 years later, I went to Marquette to be the keynote speaker at
oh,
their
wow,
culture night.
wow.
And I
Yeah.
got to actually say something so Pinoy. I was like, thank you so much, because without people like you, without programs like you, Marquette, I wouldn't be here tonight. And my parents were sitting in the audience. And I said, no, seriously, without you, I would not be here tonight, because that's how they met. But my dad was very much a storyteller. He liked to sit at the table and tell stories about things that went on back home when he was a boy. He was a boy during World War II, and out in the provinces of Pampanga, Macabebe. And he was kind of like a Huck Finn of sorts, always getting into trouble, always getting lost, always going fishing when he was supposed to be in school. So
Mm,
there's a lot of those kinds of stories that he told us at home. Meanwhile, my mom was always reading to us, right? So I had like this beautiful kind of my experience was like this beautiful experience of like both reading and oral storytelling that always came together in our household, and this sense of like longing that was created for us. I think I was born in the United States, and my extended family was there in between Manila and Pampanga, and there was always like these stories about these cousins and these huge households. And I think that part of the reason for the stories for me is, one is recording some of the things that I'd heard, and some of those kind of visceral memories. I think that I think I could say that a lot of like these visceral memories of either Manila or Pampanga, or because now I've been there as an adult. I've been there quite a bit, in search of these moments that my father and my mother would talk about, right? Are a part of the work that I do. But in part, yeah, when you think about, you're talking about Oliver and that monument, it's like now I have several nephews and nieces who are second generation American born, and who are also mixed, right? So they're not like they've got other ethnicities and cultures and stories within their own blood. There's kind of a gap in that legacy, and handing down story, tradition, culture, that kind of thing. And they're hungry for it. Like my nieces are so very hungry for it. So
mhm.
I find like some of the stories that I have been working on all these years are in part to kind of feed me and my hunger and longing for that culture, that desire to connect back to the Philippines, but also it's a way of sharing the stories with my nephews and nieces as they move further away from the islands, so to speak.
That's very interesting that you said that, your mother was, uh, into, I guess, the written word, and your father was more of an oral. So both of those, how they kind of bounce off each other, kind of calibrated its way into you,
Hmm.
where that kind of was a launch pad for your own storytelling. That's just very interesting. And the fact that they met at a Filipino culture, and they met at a PCN in the 50s. I mean,
Right? Can
I
you
mean,
believe
who, yeah, who knew that there was a piece? I mean, for our WPVM listeners that aren't aware of this, the different Filipino organizations at different universities across the country that have significant a Filipino student body will often have this thing called the PCN, a Philippine Cultural Night, where dancing, communal get together, singing, um, and it's become kind of a part of our
eating?
culture over here.
Yeah.
Um, let's see. There's so many things I'd like to ask you, but I'm kind of getting I'm getting scrambled. Um, personally, being a writer myself, I believe that, you know, we're often told that writers are looking for a singular voice. We're looking for our voice. We want to find our voice. But in reality, at least for me, I don't think we have one singular voice. I think we have a collection of personas
Hmm.
because, we have the Evelina that's, an auntie, a tita, a daughter, a writer, all these different things. Now you've moved around a lot while growing up. Talk about that movement from place to place and the impact that it has on your writing insofar as perhaps the different personas that you occupy as a storyteller.
Right. Well, I think that one of the things that so those moves all happened before I was 12, and I think that what it meant was that I was always the new girl wherever we went.
Hmm.
And then on top of that, the girl who came from the immigrant family, right, who came from a Filipino family, and I'm the oldest of six.
Mm.
There was for me always introducing myself and always and then at the same time, with all those different moves, my parents were very much community leaders, so I always looked to them, because even though we were new to a community, there always seemed to be a lot of people in our house.
Hmm.
And there was always something that they were organizing, trying to make the kind of the general community aware of their presence and sort of the contributions they could offer if the doors were open.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? So there, I was always watching that, and then I think there's something about being firstborn where you're always like starting new things for everybody. I mean, you're the firstborn child, you're the first in the school, you're the first Filipina. I can't tell you how many times I've been the first Filipina-American somewhere, you know, like
Yeah.
whether it's in the classroom or it's teaching or it's whatever it is. So I mean, I think, for me, all of that plays into this the this like gathering of stories that within me, and then this need to kind of tell it, because growing up, it's interesting that you talk about creating lists for your MFA program. I had to do the same thing in 1993, and guess what, I couldn't come up with 10 Filipino American writers back in that day. I could only come up with a small handful, and you probably could say them with me. It's like Bienvenido Santos, um, uh, 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 Carlos Bulasan, right? And Jessica Hagedorn, Ninoshka Rosca. I mean, like Peter Bacho,
Peter
and
Baccio.
then I
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
yeah, and then I was like, oh, I needed 10. I could only come up with 5. And then so then I started to fill that in with Filipino writers from the Philippines. So that was how I got my list. And then even the Filipino American writers were not American born. They were all, they all immigrated here. So their experiences were really different than mine. And their stories are really different than mine. And
Yeah.
their
Yeah.
reasons for writing are different than mine. And guess what? That also meant that I was reading all these stories growing up, because I was an avid reader, that were not reflecting my story, which didn't stop me from reading, didn't stop me from loving like literature, didn't stop me from wanting to write. But it took me a long minute when I started writing to realize that I should be writing my stories, because
Hmm.
somewhere in the world they were telling me my stories weren't as important as other people's stories. You know what I'm
Yes.
saying?
Yeah. And that's the kind of talking point or topic that comes up in the MFA program among BIPOC
Mhm.
or students of color. Um, can you talk about, let's see, your own, I guess, influences? I guess you couldn't find a lot of Filipino authors, but Filipino American History Month, is coming up, and I just remember Jose Antonio Vargas, who came to Asheville, and he did a presentation, at one of the one of the events for, I think it was Pisca Legal Services,
Mhm.
and he was he's a journalist, and somebody had asked him, I think at a tea party event of all things, why are there so many Filipinos here in the United States, as if that's a bad thing. And he said, well, sir, have you not heard of the Filipino-American War, and
Right.
what he told the guy was, well, we're here because you were there, which I think,
That's a great way.
nobody really says that, but that's really kind of at the heart of that, you
Yeah.
know. But can you talk about, this wonderful book here, When the Hibiscus Falls? A lot of stories in here about women that are struggling with, where they are in the world. They know where they are, but sometimes where they are aren't where they want to be, or they
Mhm.
know that they should speak up about certain things, but they're kind of held back because of uh, various things. Can you speak on this, and what the inspiration behind these short
Sure.
stories are?
So, I actually feel like it's an interesting way of classifying them. I actually think the women in the stories are pretty strong women, and an original title would have been like the very first. What at one time was this very short story at the very beginning of the book, which is called "Strength is the Woman." And
Hmm.
what I was really interested in, and which is a subversion of the origin story of how man and woman came to be, Malakas and Maganda. But I think for me, many of those stories are about kind of the difficult situations that some women find themselves in, and all the women are either Filipino American or Filipino born in America, or in some cases they're actually in the Philippines. Some of them are the surviving comfort women of World War II, the Lolas, as we affectionately call them. But many of the stories are about really how they navigate through the difficult spaces
Hmm.
that they're placed in, and find like interesting and creative ways to assert their voice and to be the strong one in the household or in the community, or whatever that is. And one of the things when the writing of this book was something that happened in a span of 10, sometimes maybe in a case like maybe 12 or 15 years, because the stories were written between the other projects that
Hmm.
I was doing. Like I spent 20 years researching the Filipina comfort women of World War II. And then I was writing a novel, and so there were these other things that were going on. And every now and then someone would say, "Can you contribute to this anthology?" And I would say, "Oh, I'm working on a novel." But then I'd write like what I call satellite stories, stories that are on the side, that are about minor characters in the larger work that I'm doing, or are dealing with similar topics of like that the women in the Lolas had to go through, but kind of ways of my doing research deeper into the collection. And then when I looked at the entire collection, I was like, oh, what is going on in here, and what are some of the obsessions? And what I found, how can I make this book rather than a book of just stories, like one body, right? Instead of just like these multiple stories. And what I found was like legacy was very much a part of the obsession that's
Hmm.
here, and handing down these stories from woman to woman. So
Hmm.
I think, I mean, and then I'm kind of playing too with like these myths that we are told, and sometimes not ever really taught here growing up in the United States, of like these mythological beginnings in the Philippines, and also a way to subvert them, and see into the future, and to see, so some of the stories play with the future, some of them play with the past, and many of them are very much about right now.
Yeah, let me ask you this, because we are running down with time. You mentioned that you did a lot of research. For those of us that are listening that might want to start a project that might be daunting because of the research that might entail.
Mhm.
Can you, speak on, from your own experience, what the research was like and how you handled it?
Wow. Well, in this particular case, when I first started in the early '90s, looking at the survivors. So, in case your listeners don't know, comfort women, hardly anyone doesn't know now, but during World War II, the Japanese military took more than, we're thinking, 400,000 women and girls and put them into military sex slave camps wherever they occupied during World War II. So numerous nations. In the Philippines, we think about 1,000. So when I first heard about that, I wanted to know about the women themselves. And all I found was like maybe one book written by a man, George Hicks. I think it was called Comfort Woman.
Hmm.
And it was about all these stats, but it didn't have a single picture. It didn't have a single name. It didn't have any kind of experiential, like any testimonials of what the women went through. And that's really what was interesting to me, was like trying to find out the story of the women. So I
Hmm.
think, I actually started with nothing, just like that
Yeah.
one book. And it really just took like researching little bit by little bit and finding out who else was interested. Perla Bugan, in the Bay Area, who was a choreographer. She had done some initial work with a dance that she had choreographed called Bamboo Women. So I
Hmm.
kind of went to her and I listened to her. I listened to the testimony of Lola Amonita, who is the music that she danced to at a conference I saw in Minnesota. And then I got connected to some of the women, the organizers in the Philippines, who knew some of the comfort women through Ninochka Rosca and Gabriela in New York. So I had some people in New York kind of pointing me towards the Philippines. And it was like little bit by little bit. And I want to say, if you're starting a huge project like this, not to be daunted by what seems like doors closing, especially if it's a passionate project. It's like, for me, this project was a passion project. Once I started to hear about it, I couldn't stop looking for like information, really looking for the women. And so, I mean, I could go on and on. It was 20
Well,
years, but
that's great. That's great advice. And, thank you for sharing that. We actually interviewed Betty Ann Carino, who did a book recently called With Every Ounce of Courage. It was about her mother and her role during World War II as a part of the underground resistance. And,
cool.
much the same, going and doing research and looking at old newspapers and things like that, and finally able to put together a wonderful book. Again, WPVM FM listeners of Listen and Be Heard Radio, Evalina Galang, a wonderful book of short stories, When the Hibiscus Falls, um, by Coffee House Press. And before we wrap up, I want to ask you two more questions that might not necessarily be related to books or writing. But if we were to look in your CD rack, what are some of the things we're going to find? And if you had to isolate yourself, which we've been doing the last several years now, but if
Yeah.
you had to isolate yourself in the house, and you had one or two books that you had to choose and you had to read only those, which one would you choose?
God, those are hard questions. Um, do people still have CD racks? That's my question.
Well,
Back at
if you've downloaded, whatever.
I'll tell you who I've downloaded recently. I've been listening to a lot of Grace Nono recently.
Grace, no, okay, yeah.
Yeah, I love her.
Mhm.
So that would be someone. And then wow, for my birthday party, we just went back to the '70s and like did a playlist of anything from the '70s so that we could dance. That's what we did that. And then books that I would read over and over and over again. I love Maxine Hong Kingston's Woman Warrior. I
Mhm.
read that a lot. I just got done teaching and I was really absorbed with James Baldwin's Going to Meet a Man
Mhm.
story collection. Really, really powerful and devastating. I don't know, but these are books that I would always read over and over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah, one of Baldwin's that I've read over and over again is a collection called the Cross of Redemption, because I love his essays as much as I love his fiction. Um, his essays really kind of hit me. I can go over, every time I read it, I get something new out of it. Um, but again, it is a pleasure. Evalina Galang, When the Hibiscus Falls. These are short stories, wonderful short stories, published by Coffee House Press. Evelina, for people that want to read more of your work and find out more about you and some of the events, are you on a book tour for this book right now?
I just wrapped up my book tour. I've been on tour since June 13th, and last week I finished up in Chicago at Women and Children First. I've been having a blast going from city to city,
Fantastic,
connecting with the
fantastic.
community. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And for people that want to know more about you and your work, how could they go about doing that?
You can, like, I have a website, and it's my name, evelinagalang .com, and
Mhm.
there's a lot of stuff on there, or I'm on Insta, and yeah, I'm just sort of everywhere that way, or
Fant-
come to the University of Miami and come study in
fan-
our career writing program.
Fantastic, fantastic. Again, Evelina, thank you so much. Evelina Galang, that's spelled Galang. Look her up on the internet. When the Hibiscus Falls, her brand new collection of short stories. Again, this is Tony Robles, and you are listening to Listen and Be Heard Radio on WPVM FM, the voice of Asheville. And that voice is all over online at WPVMFM.org. And right now, we're going to toss it back to the studio and Martha.